Jim Kunkle here. Make sure that you subscribe to my channel and set the notification bell to all so that you won't miss any of my new content. Join me on Tuesday, September 29th as I review the final Beryllium rule, which takes effect on September 30th, 2020. On this episode of Global Topic, we'll be talking about the final rule related to beryllium. Today's guest will be Sylvia Fontes, who's a director from Forensic Analytical Consulting Services. I hope you enjoy this episode. Sylvia, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. If you could take a second and explain a little bit about Forensic Analytical Consulting Services and your role as a director with the firm.
Sure. So as you said, I'm the director for the Sacramento, California office. We've got about 25 people in our office. The company as a whole is about 150 people throughout the western states, as well as Michigan and Texas, and now also in Florida. Our role is occupational health and safety. So we're out there protecting the employees, making sure that they're not getting exposed to, hazardous materials, anything on the job that's going to affect their health. So our goal is to protect the health of the worker.
Great. And, today our topic is going to be related to the Beryllium Rule Standard. And, Sylvia, on July 13th, 2020, U.S. Department of Labor issued the final Beryllium Standard for the general industry. Before we go into our discussion about the Beryllium Rule Standard, what is beryllium and why does it need to have exposure limits?
Well, beryllium is a metal, and you'll see it on the periodic chart. It's number 4 on the chart. It's a light metal. It's what we call an earthen metal, so it's found in volcanic rock. And what I find interesting is the United States and Russia actually produce more than 90% of the Earth's beryllium. And 2/3 of that actually comes from Utah. So it's mined and it's extracted from the rock. And the reason that we need standard for this is because of the serious health hazards associated with inhalation of beryllium, as well as having it on your skin. There's a skin exposure associated with that. So it does cause 2 diseases that we know of for sure. It causes chronic lung disease, which is somewhere between 5 to 38% fatal for the people who get that. And it's also what we call a sensitizer. So for people who become sensitized to it, and it tends to be more of a genetic component that causes that, and most of us aren't getting the genetic testing, so we're not going to know. But once you become sensitized to this metal, each time that you have an additional exposure to it, your body reacts stronger and stronger every time. And what's happening with that is you get an immune response. And what your body tries to do in your lungs is that it sends the macrophages, and basically it's kind of like the old Pac-Man. Those macrophages are going in there and they're trying to remove the beryllium, but they can't really get it out. And those macrophages die and form scar tissue, what we call fibrosis. So it becomes more and more difficult to breathe as that fibrosis builds in your lungs. So that's what we're trying to prevent by lowering the permissible exposure limit and putting procedures in place on the job site so that we don't bring this home to our families as well. So we don't want to bring it home to our children. You walk in, it's on your clothes, your children run up, give you a hug, and they're getting exposed to it as well. So we do want to prevent all of that from occurring to our workers and our families.
So related to the protective coatings industry, OSHA estimates that approximately 11,500 craft workers who perform abrasive blasting operations use slag, are exposed to elevated levels of beryllium. So how does beryllium impact the health of the workers who are exposed?
So, as I mentioned, it is a lung disease and it is fatal. So we're either going to breathe it in. So as we're doing our abrasive blasting, normally we're protected when we're doing the abrasive blasting. When we're doing our setup, our cleanup of that material, we'll have an exposure as we're doing decontamination. If we're not doing it properly, there's an exposure. So we're going to breathe it in, and that inhalation exposure may cause disease. And I did not mention earlier, it does cause lung cancer as well. So we've got the fibrosis that can build up, or we have the lung cancer that can develop from it. So lowering our exposure to that hopefully will lower the incidence of both of those diseases. And the one thing that we do know about it, it's not an immediate response that we feel. There's a latency period to it, anywhere from 3 months to 30 years before we notice symptoms, especially in relation to the lung cancer. With regard to the fibrosis that builds up, there's a latency period as well. It takes a buildup of that fibrosis in your lungs before you realize that it's getting more and more difficult for you to breathe. So we want to prevent that from occurring.
For the contracting operations, that the Beryllium Rule standard will become a critical compliance, on their abrasive blasting work. What resources and services, like those that Forensic Analytical Consulting Services provides, what are available for contractors?
Well, and some of the things that they need to do on the job moving forward, Forensic Analytical can certainly assist with that. They're going to need to do an exposure assessment for their employees on the job. So every different task that's being done has to have an exposure assessment done. And it will be a number of samples that need to be collected because we need to do a statistical analysis. So you'll need at least 3 samples for each task that's being done. And then we'll get those results. We'll calculate the permissible exposure limit, what that time-weighted average is, and determine whether or not there's an exposure to that. Once we have those results, and plus adding to that our observations while we're on site doing the exposure assessment, depending on those results, an exposure control plan is needed. So we have to look at the job site. We have to put plans in place to reduce and prevent exposure. Decontamination plans are going to have to be put into place. It will be different than it is with lead exposure. We can't bring that clothing home with us with the beryllium. Where clothing needs to stay on the job site, be laundered. So Forensic Analytical and other consulting firms can certainly help with the exposure assessment, the control plans that need to be put in place, and walking through each firm and their employees step by step, making sure that they have everything in place, that we lower those exposures and protect our employees. And then doing training for our employees, helping them to understand what it means to have an exposure to beryllium, how they can prevent it. So we can put all kinds of plans in place, but we really need the employees to be willing to put those plans in place, to execute those plans and protect themselves and their families.
Yeah, Sylvia, what a great conversation on such an important industry topic. In closing out this interview, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would want to leave with the viewers?
I really just want to leave the fact that beryllium exposure, we look at what OSHA's doing and everyone possibly looks at the cost of implementation and that is certainly a piece of that. OSHA will most likely be out doing inspections and that cost is going to increase as companies get citations if they're not following the procedures. What we really want to leave with our audience is the fact that beryllium does cause 2 very debilitating fatal diseases. And we really want to prevent that from occurring for our workers. So we will do all that we can to help the workers prevent these illnesses. I've spent my last 35 years in this industry as a certified industrial hygienist preventing illness. And I'm going to continue to do that as long as I can.
Well, Sylvia, I appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation with you today, and I do really appreciate the services that Forensic Analytical Consulting Services does provide to contractors and to other industries as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was great talking with you.
Hey, have a great day.
You too.
So, Joe, for the lay person who's watching this episode, who might only think that corrosion engineering is related to metal corrosion, as an overview, what else does corrosion engineering relate to?